All right, so we have a couple of files to download today. So crime.zip is actually a blank file. I think I just give you the file to download, so I'll make sure that I name it correctly the way that the blog is expecting it to be named, so you can actually follow the link. But we will need these crime.data files. So this is a zip file. I'm guessing by now, this is a zip file. I'm guessing by now you know how to install a zip file, to extract a zip file and so forth. So what we're going to do is get that downloaded, and I'm just going to extract it in the same location wherever I've got my crime data file. So here's crime data zip. I'm going to be using crime data W23 will be the one that I'm working on. I'm just going to right click this and extract all. I'll extract it to the default location, and that should create a folder called crime that has those files in it. In fact, the only one of these I really need are those. So I don't need the zip file anymore. So I've got these files. So we are, so actually what we're doing today is we're getting familiar with using the built-in dialogues. So there's several dialog boxes that you are used to working with in Excel, and many of those we can control from VBA. We can say, oh, you need to open up a file. Great, we'll just pop up the normal file dialog box you use for opening, and you can use that to open. But the big thing that we're accomplishing today is we are making headway on your on project number 5. That's the one after user forms. It used to be project number 6, and it was designed to be like a final project because it brings together a lot of the things that we've done throughout the semester. And it is generally recognized by students as the most difficult / time consuming project to do. I used to have it due on the last day of class when everything else was due in your lives. And it was just really difficult. And so the 5th project was pretty lightweight, so I just switched those two. So the last project that you'll have for this class is a pretty lightweight one, and that'll be when things are really heating up for the rest of your classes. But I'm going to get you started. Like the stuff we do in class today, if you remember to do it, you can kind of lift and shift. You can take this stuff right out of the class today and drop it in to get started for that project. So I'm trying to lighten your load a little bit while in the context of teaching you about using files and manipulating some of these dialog boxes. Let's go ahead and just take a look at one of these files here. Let me open up the Utah file. So this is data as it was published by the FBI. So the FBI maintains a set of data known as crimes known to law enforcement, and they keep track of turn on, whoops. And they, so it's kind of voluntary. So law enforcement agencies voluntarily report their crimes to the FBI. Not all law enforcement agencies do it, but they then aggregate that data in several ways. And one of the ways that they publish the data is they're like crimes that have happened on college campuses. And so we have like 48 states that we have data for 2011. And it shows you the enrollment of the college. This is like a summary of the next 4 columns. So there's 2, in College of Eastern Utah. Is that in Price? Is that the one that's in Price? Anyone? I think that's in Price. There were 2 violent crimes. They were both rape. Little grim data set here. There were 3 property crimes. They were larceny and motor vehicle theft. So, if we want to see how we're, comparing against the University of Utah, is BYU is not even represented in this one this year, so we can't even compete there. But this is the data that we're working with. And actually, when I came across this data, it was like 2012 when I came across this data. And at the time, like the site that I found it on, it was like, hey, if you want this data, to download this data, then email this person at the FBI. And I think now you can just download the data sets. They don't make them all available the way they used to. So I thought, okay, I'll send off an email. I said, hey, I'm Professor Allen from BYU. I'd love to get this data to use as examples for class. And I didn't hear anything. And like 2 weeks later, a CD showed up in the mail from the FBI. Here it is. I thought, wow, that's your tax dollars at work. They sent me a CD. I could have downloaded this data, but they sent me a CD. And I popped in, I looked at this, okay, this is great. I'm going to make some examples out of this. And then I set it aside. And about a couple of weeks after that, I got a phone call. I was in my office and a phone call. I had a little caller ID that said Federal Bureau of Investigation. Folks, I got to tell you, I live a really boring life. And yet when the FBI called me, I thought, oh my gosh, what have I done? And I kind of hesitantly answered the phone. And I said, this is Professor Allen. Oh, good, Professor Allen, did we send you a disk with some crime statistics on it? I said, yes. And I actually, like in my top drawer, I pulled it out. I'm looking at it right now. They said, oh, thank goodness, because that was our original. Could you send that back to us? If you promise to never, ever call me again, I will send this back to you today. So that's kind of funny. I don't know, it must have had an intern working or something, I don't know. Anyway, so that's where this data is from. And so what the project, I'm not teaching you everything you knew for this project. We're just kind of doing some of the background on it today. Ultimately, what you're going to do is I'm going to give you a database that has like 6 years of this data, kind of going back before 2011. And then it will be your job to like import the data from these spreadsheets the way the FBI publishes. It was crazy. They're publishing it as Excel files. That's how they did it. You'll have to kind of open up these files automatically one at a time, get the data out of it, and then push that into the database to bring in the next year's data for the, so that's the project that you're going to have to do. And so where we're headed today is just getting the process of manipulating those files, setting it up so that we can automatically open those files one at a time, do something with them, close them, and kind of work through that part. So this part will essentially be done for the project. That's what we're going to accomplish today. All right. So I now have that crime data XLSM file open, and I've got I've got module 1, but there's nothing in it here in module 1. But we're going to begin with, before we get to that part, we're going to introduce to this, we're going to introduce you to the file, the Office file dialog box. So let me just make a sub procedure called File Dialog. Okay, so we need to create a variable to be able to refer to the dialog box that we're going to use. So I'm just going to call it FD, and the data type is going to be as an Office file dialog. Now, usually, like when we're like declaring a variable, like an integer variable, it allocates enough space for the data type that it's going to use in memory. And it initializes that space in memory to have the default value in it for whatever that is. Now, when we create an object variable, remember, object is complex and it could be pretty big. It could have lots of properties, could have lots of methods, and it could take quite a bit of storage. But how much storage gets allocated or how much memory gets allocated every time we declare an object variable, which is what we're doing here. It's an object variable of a particular type. This can only be bound onto a file dialog object. But do we allocate enough memory to hold the object itself? Say, no, Professor, that's not how much we allocate. How much do we allocate? Anybody remember? I know the midterm was a couple of weeks ago. You've probably forgotten all of it now. But how much do we allocate when we make an object variable? And it's just enough to hold the address of where that object is. And so we're just keeping track of where that is located in memory. So what's happened at this point is that we have created a variable that has enough space to keep track of where something else is in memory. The important thing that's a little bit strange here is that we have not created a file dialog box. We've only created a variable that can hold a reference to one of these file dialogs. And so we have to do a separate step to actually create the object and then connect it up to our object variable. And so the way that we do that is set FD equal to, and then we need some statement to create the object. Most of the object variables that we have done so far, is it all of them? No, I think it's just most of them. Most of the times when we use an object variable, we are connecting on to an existing object, an object that already exists. So we're saying we've got a worksheet and we want to connect to an object variable onto that worksheet. We have a range, we want to connect an object variable onto that range. We have a chart, that's where we actually made some charts, right? We made some chart objects and we kind of made those from scratch, but that's the same thing here. This isn't just sitting around, we have to create that object, or we have to get a reference to that object. And so we're going to do that. It's a little bit different. So we're going to refer to Excel as a whole. So we're not talking about the workbook or a worksheet or a range. We're talking about all of Excel. And the way we do that is by saying application. The application refers to the object that is Excel itself. There's a collection in that called File Dialogs, File Dialog. And then these are the file dialogues we have to choose from. So I'm going to go ahead and use the file picker. And so this says, hey, give me a reference to the file dialog that's referenced by this constant. So that's a constant that is just predefined in Excel. That's number 3. That would be exactly the same as saying I want file dialog number 3. So that's just a name for a location in memory that has a 3 sitting in it. And that will now give me the object. It doesn't show the object, it just creates the object, and then I'm ready to start manipulating. And so if I want to, I can just like open up that object now and show it, and that's how I do it. I call the show method of that file dialog. So fd.show. And that will show the file dialog. At this point, I should be able to run this and have it pop open that file dialog box. Let me go ahead and run. And here it is. I can pick a file, or I can pick multiple files, and I can say, okay. Now, I didn't do anything with those because I've got to do some code to check to see what they've done. But when I show that file dialog box, it opens it modally, which means it suspends the execution of my code until that thing gets closed. And now I can start to work with it. Now you'll notice that when I run this, at least by default, I can choose multiple files. And so the whole point here is to be able to figure out which files the user has selected. It's not going to open them automatically. It's just going to tell us what the user has selected. And then we could do what we want to with them. So you can imagine that in the context of our crime data set, we might say, oh, you want to import just one particular year of crime? Well, pick the one that you want to import. And so the user could come here, they could navigate to crime, and they could say, that's the one that I want to import. And then we would need to be able to get the reference or the path to that file so we could manipulate it. So here's how we do it. So after we show it, there's a collection in this called selected items. So fd.selected items. And it's a collection. And so if I say 1, let me just do a debug.print with this. debug.print fd.selected items. So this would be the very first one that is selected. So if I run that, that should now print for me the full path to that file that I selected. I'll run this, choose Alaska. Debug. Oh, I don't want to search, I want .print. And so it's given me the full path now to that particular file. So far, not too bad. Any questions? I don't know what you would ask at this point, but we're ready to go. Now, as it turns out, you may want the user to select multiple items. In our example we're going to do today, it's going to be just one, but that would be a collection, so we could iterate across that collection. So let me just go ahead and do a for each loop in this case. So I'll just call it files as a collection. Files as, let's see, what is going to be an element of that collection? You know what? I'm not quite sure. So let me do this. Let me put a breakpoint, and I want to create a variable that I could use to control a for each loop. I could do it with like a for next loop, but I'd like to do a for each loop. Just have a little more practice with that particular kind of loop. Let me put a breakpoint here and run my code to that point. I'll pick a file. And sometimes it's really useful to know what is the data type represented by this expression. And so there's a command I've used a couple of times, but I don't think I've ever given you reason to learn it. It's called type name. And if I give an expression to type name, like 33, it'll tell me what type it is. Oh, that's an integer. Oh, that's a string. But I'm curious to know what type is this expression. also is just a string. Great. So then I can just use, I'll probably want to use a variant for the string, because when I'm using a for each loop, it can be an object variable that I use to control it, or it can be a variant, but it can't be string. So let me go ahead and dim file, I'll call it one file as a variant. Okay, so now instead of just printing that one that's selected, let's say for each one file in my selected items. And now that should bind on to each one of those. I should just be able to print one file. And that should go through and do them all. So if I select 3, it should print 3. I'll clear this off and see how that goes. Yeah, great. So whichever ones I had selected there, we have access to those. We could process those one at a time, or whatever we wanted to do. Questions? Okay. So, what happens if I don't do any of these? Cancel instead. Cancel. No problem, because that's the empty set. And so it runs through and just does that for none of them. Now, if I'm dealing with just one, in fact, I might have other code that's going on here. So it might be good to do this. Let me come here and say, after we show it, let's check to see if there's none selected. If there's none selected, we're going to get out of here. So let me just say if fd.selectedItems.count is equal to 0. If none are selected, then exit sub. Whatever else I have going on here, I don't want to do if there's no files selected. And so let me run that. Put a debug.print here. Just processed all the files. And so now if we do select some files, it'll print those 2 files and then print just processed all the files. But if I don't select any, I'm going to skip all of this because I'm exiting the sub directly. And so, of course, there won't be anything to print, but we want to make sure that we don't get to this either. So we run that. Even if I select a bunch and hit cancel, it should send back then the empty set. If I say cancel, there's nothing selected. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now, there are some, let's suppose I only want to allow them to select one. Before I show it, there's some properties I can set, there's some configuration things that I can do here. So let me say FD, oh, it's the first one, allow multi-select equals false. So now when I run this, if I try to select multiple ones, it just doesn't happen. I'm holding the shift key down and selecting the control key down. It only allows me to select one. So that's just a property. Are you allowed to select multiple items or not? The other thing that sometimes is useful is to control what filters are here. So right now, this is just all files. Maybe I'm interested in only showing the Excel files for this. So let's see how what we would have to do that. Okay, so before I show it, so after I have connected my object variable onto that file dialog, and before I show it, I've got some more configuration that I can do. So there's a collection called filters, and it has a property called clear. So it starts off by default, there's one filter in there, and it's star.star, it's everything. And I'm saying, I don't even want to make that an option. I'm going to start off by erasing all of those, and I will put in the filters that I want to put in. So fd.filters.add, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it 2 parameters. I'm going to give it the label that I want to display. And so I'll call this Excel files. EXCEL files. And then the second argument is a little bit strange, but it is a comma separated list of filters. So what's going to be an Excel file? star.xls, comma, I'm putting the comma inside the quotes, star.xlsx, star.xlsm, XLSB, I think is another one. And there may be others, those are the ones I know. Okay, so that is now going to be one filter that the user can choose from. I might say, you know what, I want to add just another option for them to filter down to Excel macro-enabled files. Or Excel files, maybe I'll put in parentheses macro-enabled. So that would be XLS, XLSM, and XLSB. And who knows, we'll put on text files. Or, yeah, we'll make one that says text files. And that will be star.txt, only one filter. And for kicks, we'll do one more, we'll do CSV files. Kind of a long label. I'm not quite sure how that will look. .csv. All right. Now, I think one of these is going to be selected by default. So let me just run this and see what it looks like. Yeah, so my top one is selected by default. And I can fit it all in there. That looks pretty good. And let's see, we only have XLSX here. So let me come up a level where I do have an XLSM. I can filter that down to just macro enabled. Yeah, so my XLSXs go away. It looks pretty good. I don't think I have any CSV files here or any text files. But I can pick, let's say I want this to show with my macro enabled as my default. Well, that is a property called the filter index. So fd.filterIndex then equals 2. And so this is going to start with 1. So that's my first one. This is my second one. So now this will come up with my macro enabled files as my second, as the default choice. So macro enabled files is the one that's selected. That's all I'm seeing. So we can control which ones the user has access to. We can't control them from saying, you know what, we don't want you to see any other kinds of files than the ones I've listed there, because the user can always come in here and actually type star.star and hit enter, and that will bring them all in. So we can't use it to hide what the user is seeing. If they know what to type, they can get past it. So it's really just for convenience. Okay. So here's what I'd like to do. I would like to, after we show it, do this. For each file that they've selected, I just want to call another sub-procedure and pass the path to that workbook. So let's just say we'll create a sub-procedure called process one file. I'm going to define it right here. I'm going to call it right here, then we'll go define it. Process one file. And I'm going to pass it. Oh, I called it one file. I'll pass it one file. Whoops, no parentheses needed. Okay, so now this procedure here is just going to let the user pick a file, and then we'll send it off to somewhere else to do the work. Could I do the work right here? Yeah, I could, but I think it makes sense to separate this functionality apart, especially because when I'm doing the debugging, when I'm writing this thing, I'll probably want to have a shorter way to pick the file I'm working on than having to go and pick the file dialog each time. So I'll come back here to my top, and I will make that procedure process one file. Now I am sending it a path, so I will need something to receive that value that I'm sending. So I'll declare a variable here called file path. That'll be a string. At this point, let me just do a debug.print at process1 file. And I'll print the file path. So now when I run my file dialog, it lets me pick the files, and it should then, let me take out the debug print that I had in here. Instead of printing it here, all we're going to do is we'll send whatever was selected off the process1 file, and it will do the printing, and we'll do more with it here shortly. I'll run this. Ooh, process1 file. Okay, so it's expecting to get a string, but one file is what type? This is actually kind of an interesting, little problem that you sometimes run into in VBA. And it probably bears a little bit of a side discussion. So let's talk about it right now. Let me open up Paint so I can draw something that you can see. Good old Microsoft Paint. So let's suppose that let's kind of represent the variable that we're creating here in memory. And I'll give that variable a name. And what do we call it? We called it one file. Okay, so we have this variable called one file. And what data type is it? It's a variant. Okay, so I'll just put a little note over here. By the way, this is variant. And we're actually putting a string, like a full path, in there. Now, when we are setting up this variable here, file path, it's going to be a string. So a different location in memory. And it's going to be a string. So we'll just copy that down here. This one is called file path. And why don't we move this down to this one? And this one's a string. Now, so we've got this, so when we run our code, we've got this created and it's got a path in it. And then when we call this statement here, when we say we are ready to call process1 file and send it one file, it's tempting to think that these are two separate variables, that we've got, this is some location in memory that has this name. It's got the data that we want. But when we pass a bare variable, like just a variable name, it's not an expression where it's like, this variable plus something or the uppercase version of this variable, it's just the variable. Then when we create file path, like when we call that procedure, you remember that this memory gets allocated when this procedure starts to run. VBA says you want to run that procedure. It says, great. It looks through that and says, what's all the variables we need? And it allocates that memory. And if you have passed a variable to this parameter, it says, great, you already have a variable made for that. We don't need to allocate this for it. All we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, by the way, this variable name is going to point at the same location in memory. And so even though it looks like we're declaring another variable here, on the condition where you are passing just a bare variable, like we are here, to a parameter, it says, great, don't make another variable for it, just make that another name. In which case it has to be the same data type. That's what the error it's giving us. When I try to run this, what does it say? Run argument type mismatch. Right? So you're sending a variant, it's expecting a string, no good. A couple ways we could solve this. One way that we could solve it is by just making this a variant. I don't really like that because this is just a string. I think it should be a string. Another way that we could do it is just by not passing a bare variable. We could convert this to a string, CSTR, convert something to a string. And as soon as I do that, this is not a bare variable, this is the result of a function, and so it has to create a new variable to receive it. And so now if I run this, it should let me pick that, and it gets past that error. And these need to be Excel files. Well, I can only pick one now. And we got at process1 file and the name of the file that we passed in. Strangely enough, if I even take off the convert to string and just send this in parentheses, this is also changing it from being a bare variable to being an expression. And so this is going to allow it to work as well. So I'm going to run this, but I am going to do two things. I'm going to change my filter index to 1 because I'm going to be working with just regular Excel files. And I'm going to set multi-select to true because I'd like to be able to select more than one. Whoa, pardon me. So you'll notice that still doesn't have an error, and it's because it's only on the condition where you're passing a bare variable to it that it says just use the same location in memory. The implications of that can be somewhat unexpected. What would happen if up here in process1 file, let's kind of go back to this way where I am passing a bare variable. And I'll make this work by changing this temporarily to be variant. Okay, so now this will work, but it will do this. So if I just run it, nothing will look different here. Goes through and processes those files or prints those text streams. But what does it mean if I was to change the value here? What if I was to say file path equals howdy? And then after I called it here, I was to print one file. Debug.print. Now, this is going to send one file up here. It's going to be a path. Realize that my two variable names now, one file and file path, are pointing at the same location in memory. Which means that when I come up here and change what's happening in file path, when I change it from whatever I've just printed to howdy, it's also going to change the value of this variable because it's one location in memory that we're using two names to refer to. Do you see that? So this should print at process1 file and then a path, and then it should print howdy. And then it should go through this loop and do the next one, path name, and then howdy, even though you don't see anything happening here because it's actually being changed in the other procedure. I'll just select a couple. So this is something that can be a little bit confusing if you didn't know what was happening here. It's a strange situation, and it only happens when you pass just a variable all by itself to a parameter. So what happens if I put that in parentheses so that it's not a bare variable? It's now an expression based on the variable. What's it going to print when I run it? How will it be different? Because I'm not passing a bare variable, it can't do this trick. And so instead, file path is going to refer to its own location. We would have to create a new variable in memory. Which means that up here, when I change this, when I say file path equals howdy, it's going to put howdy here rather than here. So it will have no effect on that variable that was passed in. So it should print at process1 file, that path, and then it should print that path again. Let's go ahead and run it and see if I'm right about that. It'd be terrible if I was wrong about that, because I've spent the last 10 minutes telling you about it. Take two files. And that's terrible. Let me pass this as str. Not where I meant to put it. I'm going to put it here. Oh, did I put the parentheses on this? I think I must have. Let me undo. I meant to put the parentheses up here. So this, I'm changing it from where it's called. So it's no longer a bare variable there. Let me try it again. Okay, that's what I expected to see. So now the code that changes the variable up in the other subprocedure doesn't have any effect on one file because it's not just a bare variable that's passed to it. Probably more than you wanted to hear about that. But that's why you have to, if you're passing a variable to a parameter, the data types have to be compatible. So I'm going to change this back to be a string. And I'm going to leave that just this way, or maybe I'll convert it to a string. Okay. Let me know how well you digested that last discussion on passing variables to parameters. 5 is, I think I totally got it. 1 is, whoa. So I'm seeing 3s, 4s, and a few 5s. Okay. Yeah, it's not the simple stuff here. All right, I really don't want to change this. I don't mind printing that off. But what I'd like to do here is I would like to now process this file. I would like to actually do something with this file. And so let me declare a variable to manipulate it, WB, as a workbook variable. And now I'm going to set WB equal to workbooks.open. And I'll open file path. Let WB equal to workbooks, WRKB, okay. Oh, because I'm doing something with the return value of this method, you need to put the arguments in parentheses. Okay, so that will open that workbook. It'll display it on the screen, and it will give me a variable that I can use to refer to it by. So let's just go ahead and we'll open up the first. I'm just going to come and take a peek at a couple of these. Let me look at the first one here. Here's Alabama. And I'm going to compare Alabama to Alaska. I think I want to do Alaska. Not Alaska. One of these is going to have a little bit different experience that I want to alert you to on this project. I'm pretty sure Utah would exhibit this. So let's just go ahead and jump down to Utah. Okay. If I'm comparing Utah to Alabama, the structure of these two files is a little bit different. And can you see what it is? So our data ends in column L on Utah. It ends in column M on Alabama. Do you see why they're different? What's the difference? campus. If any of the schools that I have here have a campus, then I get a new column in here. If over here in Utah, none of the schools in Utah have a different campus. It's not like, now let's see, Utah State University. Doesn't Utah State University have more than one campus? Yeah, they have the Logan campus, but for whatever reason, we're not reporting on those different campuses. Maybe we're reporting them all together, so we don't get that campus column. This is something that can really make my data processing more complex of these files, because I can't just know the column the data is going to be in. By the way, this is the only structural difference in these files. So what can I do to simplify this process? Right? If I want to be able to say, yeah, I want to know that arson is in column M, what could I do when I open these files? What's that? I could look right here and see if this says campus. If this says campus, the data is where I expect it to be. If it says anything besides campus, what can I do to make the data where I want it to be? Just insert a column. Yeah, it's missing that column because there's no campus data. Great, put a column there. It'll still have no campus data in it, but at least we'll know everything else is there. So let's go ahead and do that. So we've opened this workbook. So let's say if WB. Now the tendency is to want to say, I'm on that workbook and I want to look at range B5. Was it B5? B5. But what's the problem with what I've just said right here? This code won't execute, and tell me if you can see why. In fact, we'll say if it is not equal to campus. It's kind of intuitive. This looks pretty good. I got that workbook open. I want to know what's in cell B5. What's the problem? A workbook doesn't have cells. There are no cells of a workbook. What has cells? A worksheet has cells, and a workbook has worksheets. So we got to somehow get to the right worksheet. What's the name of the worksheet? 11 TBL 09 AL. That is the year 2011. Table 9. It's like this is table 9 from their report that they do on crimes known to law enforcement, and it's for Alabama. So the bad news is that tab is going to be named different for every one of these workbooks. Yeah. Yes. Remember, I can refer to the sheet not only by its name, but by its location, and there's only ever one worksheet in these workbooks. So excellent. A gold star for the day. So WB dot worksheets number 1. So now if that does not, so I've got not in front of here, so that doesn't say campus, then we're needing to do some inserting. So, and if, now we'll say WB, like, you know what I may do? Just to make my code a little simpler, I might dim S as a worksheet. And then right after I open my workbook, I'll set S equal to the first worksheet in there. So now I've got a worksheet variable that's bound onto that first worksheet. And anytime I refer to S now, it's referring to that worksheet in that workbook. So if it's not campus, I want to insert something in there. So on that sheet, S dot columns 5 dot insert. When you insert a column, push everything else over. So now if I open up Utah, I'm going to put a stop right here. You go ahead and open up Utah, one that doesn't have that campus column. Okay, so I'm going to run File Dialog. I'm going to pick Utah. Okay, so now we've stopped there. Oh, it was B5. It was row was the 5. Which column do I want to insert? I inserted it at the 5th column. I want to insert it at the 2nd column. So that's my mistake. So let me change it back to a 2. I'll delete that column here by hand. We'll run that code again. Okay, so now it's put the campus column in place here. Oh, so that's excellent. Now, so at this point, I've kind of got that set up. Now I've got everything in the right columns. That looks great. I better make sure I don't save this because I don't want to interrupt my source data. So when I close this, I want to close it without saving. So how am I going to close this? What shall I do to tell it to close? Don't worry about saving. Let's just get it closed. It's going to be a method. There's a method called close of what object? A little louder? Yeah, so that's the whole reason that I want to keep track of the workbook that I opened is so I can use that handle to be sure I'm closing the right one. It might be tempting just to say, listen, just open the workbook. It'll be the active workbook. And then do all your stuff with the active workbook. But several things like while it's in the middle of processing, like if someone like clicks and activates another workbook, you're closing something you didn't expect to close. And so it's really a good idea to say, I opened that workbook. I'm keeping track of the workbook I just opened, and I'll use that object variable to close it. So after I do whatever I'm doing here, we'll come down here and say wb.close. It has an argument here of save changes, and I'm going to save changes as false. Now that will close it without saving the changes and without prompting the user to save the changes. So next time now I haven't modified that file. Next time I open it, it'll be in the same structure. All right, now kind of here in the spirit of doing this development, I'm going to be wanting to work on Utah I want to keep opening Utah while I'm getting that one worked out. And so I'm not that thrilled about having to run this one and go choose Utah each time. So I'm just going to make a runner, a sub runner here. Acme sub runner. And let's see, somewhere I must have printed Utah up here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to call process one file. And I'm going to pass it a fixed one. So instead of making me, the user / developer, while I'm developing this, go pick the file I'm after, I can just run this now and it will automatically send in Utah. And I'll just run this one. And it's opened up Utah. Did I close it as well? I've opened it and closed it. I'll move my stop above the close. There we go. So now it's got it open and we're kind of ready to work with that a little more easily than having to go pick it each time. One of the things, especially when you're new at coding, is like, how long will it take me to write that little procedure that would open up to just that one? It feels like extra work to do it because it's not part of the solution that you need to generate. And you got to think about how to do it, but it's going to save time because you're going to be able to go straight to that one. And like each time you're testing it, your work will go faster. Next thing I'm going to do to kind of get us going here is I'm going to delete these two summary columns because you are not going to enter summary data into the database. You're only entering the base data. So you're going to enter student enrollment, the 5 numbers for violent crime, and the 5 numbers for property crime. So I'm just going to delete column I and column D. So let's get back to my code. So S dot columns 9 dot delete, s dot columns 4 dot delete. And so now I'm left with just the data that I need to process, sitting in exactly the right place. And that's going to make my life a little bit easier. Now I would really be in trouble if I saved this, because it would start deleting my data. The second time I opened it, if I had saved this when it closed, it would actually be deleting my data. So that's good that we're closing without saving. Okay, now the assignment for the project that we're going to be working on is, don't let the user pick the files they want to process. It's you're going to assume that they are in this location. So assume that there is a folder called crime that's located at the same location as the workbook that we're using to process it. So we don't want the user to have to go pick it. We just want to know that's where it is. So let's take a look at that. Go ahead and run this the rest of the way out. And I'll create another sub procedure here called process all. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to start off by building the list of files that I'm going to process. I'll make those into a collection, and then I will go ahead and once I've built that collection, I'll have another loop that goes through and processes those collections individually, or process those files one at a time. So we'll declare a couple of things here. Let me declare files as a collection, as a new collection. When I use the keyword new and I'm declaring an object variable like a collection, not only does it allocate the memory to hold this object, but it makes one of these objects too, puts it in that location, and then binds the variable to it. That is just the same as set files equal to a new collection without saying new. So dim files as collection just allocates enough memory to hold a reference to an object. And then this actually then creates the object and binds that variable onto its location. So by shortcut, I can do both of those together just by saying as a new collection. Maybe I'll go ahead and leave this one up here, but comment it out. I'm also going to want to dim file name as a string. You'll see why. We'll leave that here in just a moment. Okay, now what we're about to do goes back to the early days of BASIC. And we would definitely not write the language this way today if we were writing this language. So it's going way back past the 70s or the 90s into the 1970s where this language has its origin. And to really understand this, I don't think we've done this before, but let me go open up PowerShell. POWL. Okay, back in the olden days, this is what your whole computer looked like. There were no windows, there were no colors. It was just this command prompt. And if you were curious to know what you had around, you would type in this statement, dir, stands for making a directory. It shows you the files that are there. Like back in the day when this is the way that we did it, you could read the files go past. Like, let me do this. Let me change directories to crime. Oh, to downloads. Change directories to crime and do a directory right here. That would go slow enough that you're like, you know what? I could read those as they went. Like after they sped computers up, they had to have ways to be able to make it so you could actually see, what you used to just be able to read as it went by. But let's say I didn't want to see all of the files. I wanted to see just the ones that start with M. I can say m*.xlsx. So just show the files that start with an M, have anything else and end with .xlsx. And now that's just giving me the directory of these. So we can still use this stuff today, but this stuff was invented a long time ago. And whoever does this anymore, like nerds, geeks, when they really want to show that they know a lot, they'll open up that command prompt and they'll do something. But the whole point here is that this statement right here has direct expression in VBA. So let me come here and let me just print dir. So dir is a statement in VBA that looks at and gets back this list of files from the operating system. Parentheses. Do I have to tell it where to look? I think I got to give it a path. This workbook.path. Let's see what this workbook.path is. Downloads. If I say dir of downloads, that should give me something. It's got to be a string. Downloads /star.star. There we go. I had to tell it, I had to give it that filter as well. So I could look at downloads / for me, that's where my crime data is, /m star.xlsx. And now we should be looking at those files that start with M. But that dir statement, that dir function, does not bring them all back. It brings back the first one, and in the background, it remembers the other ones. So if I ask for dir again just by itself, it gives me the next one, and the next one, and the next one, until I run out of M files. And then it gives me a 0-length string. And then if I ask again, it gives me an error. It says there's nothing to give. I already told you there was none. When I gave you back the 0-length string, stop asking for the next one. So like if we're doing this today, we would send back the whole list. We put it in an object. We'd give you some methods to be able to deal with it. But this is the way that you do it in like the beginning days of BASIC. What do you think? Are there objects that we could use? Yeah. Like there's a thing called the scripting object, it's the file system object, but it's a Windows object. Really easy to set up and use here. But as soon as I do that, my code wouldn't work on someone that's using Mac. So when I can use something that's native to the language, I'm better off because it will be cross-platform compatible. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm now going to say file name equals dir. Let's do one more before we do that. Let's do one more variable here. Let's dim path as a string. And I'm going to make the path that goes all the way to where my crime files are. So path is going to take this workbook.path. And I'm going to concatenate onto that. Ooh, I'm going to do this badly and then we'll fix it. /crime /. So if I ask for workbook.path, it's going to tell me, oh, you're in the downloads folder. And what I'm trying to do is just put this on the end of it so that I've got the full path to where those crime files are. But what's the problem with what I'm doing here? If I'm thinking about cross-platform compatibility, Mac users. I see some of you giving me the sign language. Is that Windows uses a / between folders? Mac uses a /. Good news is I can ask what the proper path separator is based on the Excel installation. So application dot path separator. And so that will give me a / if it executes on Windows. It will give me a / if it executes on Mac. Oh, wonderful. So I can take that, and instead of actually building that into the string, I can concatenate on the path separator and concatenate it on here as well. So now that will give me the correct path, whether it runs on Mac or Windows. If you know it's going to run on Windows, use the \, that would work just fine. Okay, so that's going to give me the path that I have to work with. So now what I'm going to say is, I want a directory of the path concatenated with the filter that I'm going to put on it. So path concatenated with star.xlsx. I don't want just the M files. I want all of the XLS files in that folder. And this will now put the first one into file path, but it will remember the rest of the list behind the scenes. And now I'm just going to make a little loop here. I'm going to do until file name is equal to a 0-length string, because that's how it tells me that it's done. It sends back a 0-length string and says there's nothing else to give. Then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add into my collection files. I'll say files.add, and I'm going to add my path concatenated with the file name. So file name is going to have in it the first file from the list, but I want the full path to that file name. I'm bringing in the path and the file name, and I've just put that in the collection. I'm then going to tell my file name to get the to take on the value of the next file from the list. And so I'm going to do this. If this brings back a file, first of all, if this brings back no file, if there's no file that meets that criterion, then I don't execute in this loop at all. I'm going to execute until file name is blank. If there was nothing there that met the filter, this will be blank and I'll skip by the loop. But if there's something, I'll add that something into my collection of files. And then I will ask for the next one. And then I'll check again. Hey, is there a next one? If the answer is no, we're done. If the answer is yeah, there is, we'll add that one and prepare for the next one. Let me put a stop right here. And I'll run this. And if that worked right, we should be able to see that we've got my files has a count property. There's 48 files there. I can look at files sub1, and it's Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, Arizona, and so forth. So at that point, I've got a collection that's got all the files in it that I want to work with. And now I probably just want to make another loop right here. We declare like a variable to control this. I will dim one file as variant. And we'll do a similar little for each file, for each loop down here. So instead of looking at the selected ones, it's going to say for each one file in files. Process one, and we'll send the one file. So now this procedure will say, hey, we've now said, listen, this part is just going to go get the files and it's going to send them one at a time to be processed. So the part that we need to do to actually do all the files is done. Like you could lift these two procedures from this example in class, put them right into your solution for that project, and down to one file, and you are off and running. Did we really have to put this into a collection and then process the collection? Or couldn't we just have, instead of adding path and file name, couldn't we just have called process one file here? And the answer is yes, we could have. But the reason that's dangerous is because if I do anything down here with the dir function, it will interrupt the list that I was building. And so we usually want to say, listen, if you're trying to build a list of things to process, build the list first. Don't do anything else in the process of building that list. That way you don't have to worry about something else interrupting it, because a call to the dir statement anywhere else in my code is going to pull the next file off. Or if I call dir and give it a path, it'll build a new list to work with. Okay, kind of a lot to bite off for one day. Show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how full your brains are at this moment. 5 is overflowing. 0 is, come on, lay it on me. All right, we got like 6 minutes to go, but I think that's probably a good place to stop for today. Any questions? Now, you dare someone to ask a question now. Your fellow students are all, he's about to dismiss class. Don't ask a question. All right, if you have questions, come and see me. This will get you started and it gets us introduced to working with files. Thanks for coming. Class dismissed.
So
Let me stop the recording.